Imagine if death didn't arrive as an accident or a disease or a mystery. Imagine if it arrived as a person. Not a monster, not a shadow, but a worker. Someone who clocks in, someone who gets tired, someone who has rules to follow and consequences if they don't. Right now, somewhere in some version of history you were never taught, there is a quiet office, a ledger of names, and a door that opens when your time is up. And behind that door, someone is waiting. If you click away now, you'll never meet them. Before we open that door, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from and what do you do for a living? Because by the end of this story, you might start wondering if your job is as ordinary as you think. The details changed. The structure did not. Again and again, the same idea emerged independently. Someone must be responsible for this transition. Someone must arrive at the moment life ends and make sure it goes where it is supposed to go. But why did humans need that idea so badly? Because randomness is terrifying. If death can strike without purpose, then life has no pattern, no fairness, no sequence you can understand or prepare for. But if death is a task, if someone performs it, then there are rules. Even if you don't know those rules, they must exist. And rules mean the universe is not chaos. So humanity gave death a role. In ancient Egypt, this role became almost bureaucratic. The dead did not wander aimlessly, they were processed. Their hearts were weighed against the feather of truth, overseen by deities whose responsibilities were clearly defined. Among them was Anubis, the jackal-headed guide who prepared the dead and escorted them into judgment. Anubis was not evil, he was not cruel, he was a professional. He had a job to do. In early Hindu traditions, the figure of Yama emerges not as a monster, but as a king and judge, the first mortal to die, who then took on the responsibility of ruling the realm of the dead and ensuring that each soul reached its proper destination. He too is an administrator of endings. Across the world, in ancient Mesoamerica, among the Aztec, the underworld was governed by rulers like Mictlantecutli, whose duty was to receive the dead who had completed their journey through the dangerous paths of the afterlife. Again, the pattern repeats. The dead are expected. Someone is waiting. There is an order to the crossing. These figures were not identical, but they shared something profound. They were not the cause of death. They were its caretakers. That distinction matters because it reveals how early humans were trying to solve two different fears at once. The first fear was the moment of dying. The second, quieter, deeper, was what happened after. And in both cases, the idea of a worker offered comfort. If someone's job is to carry death, then someone is also there to receive you. You are not alone in the moment you leave. You are expected. And yet, woven into these early myths is a subtle tension. If death is a job, then it can be done well or badly. It can be done fairly or unfairly. It can be done on time or too soon. Which means death is not only a guide, it is a decision. And humans, even in their earliest stories, began to wonder, who decides when the worker comes? Some myths answered with fate, a cosmic thread measured and cut by unseen forces. In later Greek mythology, this would become formalized in the image of the Fates, who spin, measure, and sever the thread of life. In Norse traditions, the Norns carved destiny into the roots of the world tree. In many traditions, death's worker does not choose. They follow instructions. But instructions from whom? The question lingers like smoke. In the oldest versions of these stories, the boundary between life and death is described almost like a border crossing. There are gates, rivers, bridges, paths, obstacles, and always someone stationed there. Someone who checks, someone who ensures the right passage. A guard, a ferryman, a guide, a collector. Each role says something about the society that imagined it. Agricultural societies imagined orderly transitions, cycles, seasons, death as harvest. Warrior societies imagined selection, judgment, honor, death as recruitment. Bureaucratic empires imagined records, lists, procedures, death as administration. In every case, the afterlife reflected the world of the living, and the worker of death looked like one of us, sometimes tired, sometimes stern, sometimes compassionate, sometimes distant, but always present. There is an ancient tale told in multiple forms across Eurasia about a traveler who encounters the one responsible for death. In some versions, the traveler is a peasant, in others, a prince. The details change, but the meeting is always strangely ordinary. Death is not a storm or a monster. Death is sitting by the road, waiting, working. In one telling, the traveler asks, "Why do you take the young and leave the old? Why do you take the kind and spare the cruel?" And the figure answers, "I do not choose. I arrive when I am sent." That answer appears again and again across languages and centuries. Death in these early human visions is not free. Death is employed. And employment implies hierarchy, which brings us to a subtle shift that begins to happen as myths evolve. The earliest stories imagined many different beings connected to death: guides, judges, guardians. But slowly, in many cultures, these roles begin to compress. The guide and the taker become the same figure. The collector and the judge become one. The job becomes centralized. And as it does, the image sharpens. The idea of a single figure who arrives at the moment of death becomes more vivid, more personal. No longer just an escort after life ends, but an agent present at the instant it does. That shift matters because it changes how humans relate to death emotionally. If death is something that happens, you fear the event. But if death is someone who arrives, you imagine a meeting, a final encounter. And encounters can be negotiated, pleaded with, resisted, or accepted. That is why so many early stories include attempts to bargain with death's worker, offering gifts, asking for time, making deals, or tricking the one who has come to collect them. These are not just stories of fear, they are stories of hope, that the system might bend, that the worker might hesitate, that the rules might have loopholes. But behind that hope is a quiet admission. The worker exists, the job exists, and sooner or later the worker will come for everyone, even those who invented the story. And so, by the time written history begins, the idea is already deeply rooted in the human mind. Death is not only an ending, it is a task carried out by someone, a role that must be fulfilled, a duty that must be performed. Which leads to a haunting, almost uncomfortable thought that ancient people rarely said out loud, but often implied in their myths. If death is a job, then there must have been a first person to take it. Who were they? Were they chosen? Did they volunteer? Or were they, like all of us, simply doing what they were told, stepping into a role that existed long before them and will continue long after? The fire burns low. The story continues, and as humanity moves from myth into structured civilization, something remarkable begins to happen. We stop imagining death as a distant, mysterious duty, and we start organizing it, cataloging it, administering it. As if somewhere beyond sight, the worker who carries death now has colleagues, supervisors, and a system that keeps records of every name. The office is being built, and the job is about to become much larger than a single figure waiting in the dark.
The door to the afterlife does not open into chaos. It opens into order. Not the comforting kind of order you find in a tidy home, but the colder, sharper order of a system that cannot afford mistakes. A place where every life is recorded, every action noted, every name accounted for. If Chapter 1 imagined death as a worker, Chapter 2 reveals something more unsettling, that the worker does not work alone. There is an institution behind them, and like all institutions, it has rules. In the earliest river civilizations, as humans learned to count grain, measure land, and record taxes, something profound happened in the imagination of the afterlife. Death was no longer a mysterious crossing. It became a process, a sequence of steps, a pathway with checkpoints. In ancient Egypt, death was handled with a precision that mirrored the administrative brilliance of the Nile kingdoms. The deceased did not simply arrive somewhere unknown, they entered a system of judgment overseen by divine officials. Their heart was weighed against truth in the presence of deities whose roles were clearly defined. The god who guided the dead, Anubis, did not improvise. He performed a duty that had been established long before any individual life began. Beside him stood Thoth, recording the results of the weighing like a clerk documenting a verdict. The final judgment rested with Osiris, a king presiding over a court where the fate of the soul was decided not by chance, but by evidence. It is difficult to miss the resemblance to a courtroom or to a government office. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of records, of censuses, of grain stores, of labor assignments, and so its vision of death became an extension of that logic. Nothing was left unaccounted for. The afterlife was a continuation of administration. And in that administration, death itself was only the first step. Across the world in ancient China, the same pattern emerged, but with even more striking familiarity. The Chinese underworld was imagined as a vast bureaucratic network, often described as resembling the imperial court. There were judges, prosecutors, guards, and scribes. Souls passed through multiple courts, each responsible for evaluating a different aspect of a person's life. At the center of this system stood figures like Yanluo Wang, the ruler who presided over the dead and assigned their destinies. He did not act alone. There were registrars who kept the book of life and death, marking the moment each soul was to be summoned. The detail is striking. Your death was written down, scheduled, filed, and when the time came, someone was sent to collect you because the system had determined it was your turn. It is here that the idea of death as a job evolves into something more structured. The worker who arrives at your final moment is no longer acting independently. They are following orders issued by a larger authority, documented in a ledger that cannot be altered by pleading or bribery. Or can it? Because even within these structured visions, cracks begin to appear. Stories of clerical errors, misplaced names, and souls taken too early or too late. These stories are not accidents of imagination. They are reflections of human experience with real bureaucracies, where mistakes happen and systems fail. And so the afterlife becomes not just orderly, but fallible. In medieval Europe, as Christian theology developed alongside the expansion of church institutions, the idea of a recorded judgment becomes even more formalized. The concept of the Book of Life appears, a divine record in which every soul's deeds are written, awaiting final judgment. Angels and demons function not just as spiritual beings, but as agents of a system of accountability. Even the later image of the Grim Reaper, though often depicted as a solitary figure, emerges from a culture deeply familiar with plagues, censuses, and mass mortality records. Death in these societies was counted, tracked, and documented. The imagination followed suit. The door to the afterlife does not open into chaos. It opens into order. Not the comforting kind of order you find in a tidy home, but the colder, sharper order of a system that cannot afford mistakes. A place where every life is recorded, every action noted, every name accounted for. If Chapter 1 imagined death as a worker, Chapter 2 reveals something more unsettling, that the worker does not work alone. There is an institution behind them, and like all institutions, it has rules. In the earliest river civilizations, as humans learned to count grain, measure land, and record taxes, something profound happened in the imagination of the afterlife. Death was no longer a mysterious crossing. It became a process, a sequence of steps, a pathway with checkpoints. In ancient Egypt, death was handled with a precision that mirrored the administrative brilliance of the Nile kingdoms. The deceased did not simply arrive somewhere unknown, they entered a system of judgment, overseen by divine officials. Their heart was weighed against truth in the presence of deities whose roles were clearly defined. The god who guided the dead, Anubis, did not improvise. He performed a duty that had been established long before any individual life began. Beside him stood Thoth, recording the results of the weighing like a clerk documenting a verdict. The final judgment rested with Osiris, a king presiding over a court where the fate of the soul was decided not by chance, but by evidence. It is difficult to miss the resemblance to a courtroom or to a government office. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of records, of censuses, of grain stores, of labor assignments, and so its vision of death became an extension of that logic. Nothing was left unaccounted for. The afterlife was a continuation of administration. And in that administration, death itself was only the first step. Across the world in ancient China, the same pattern emerged, but with even more striking familiarity. The Chinese underworld was imagined as a vast bureaucratic network, often described as resembling the imperial court. There were judges, prosecutors, guards, and scribes. Souls passed through multiple courts, each responsible for evaluating a different aspect of a person's life. At the center of this system stood figures like Yanluo Wang, the ruler who presided over the dead and assigned their destinies. He did not act alone. There were registrars who kept the book of life and death, marking the moment each soul was to be summoned. The detail is striking. Your death was written down, scheduled, filed. And when the time came, someone was sent to collect you, because the system had determined it was your turn. It is here that the idea of death as a job evolves into something more structured. The worker who arrives at your final moment is no longer acting independently. They are following orders issued by a larger authority, documented in a ledger that cannot be altered by pleading or bribery. Or can it? Because even within these structured visions, cracks begin to appear. Stories of clerical errors, misplaced names, and souls taken too early or too late. These stories are not accidents of imagination. They are reflections of human experience with real bureaucracies, where mistakes happen and systems fail. And so the afterlife becomes not just orderly, but fallible. In medieval Europe, as Christian theology developed alongside the expansion of church institutions, the idea of a recorded judgment becomes even more formalized. The concept of the Book of Life appears, a divine record in which every soul's deeds are written, awaiting final judgment. Angels and demons function not just as spiritual beings, but as agents of a system of accountability. Even the later image of the Grim Reaper, though often depicted as a solitary figure, emerges from a culture deeply familiar with plagues, censuses, and mass mortality records. Death in these societies was counted, tracked, and documented. The imagination followed suit. The Reaper was not simply killing at random. He was collecting according to a list. Across cultures, this pattern repeats. As human societies develop systems of governance, their visions of death adopt similar structures. In the Aztec worldview, those who died did not all go to the same place. Their destination depended on the manner of their death, evaluated by the gods who governed different realms. Mictlantecuhtli presided over one such domain, receiving those whose deaths aligned with his realm's criteria. Again, there is classification, sorting, assignment. Death is not the end of the process, it is the beginning of it. And within that process, the worker who carries death becomes a messenger, a courier operating within a vast, unseen network. It is tempting to think of these myths as primitive attempts to explain the unknown, but they reveal something deeper about the human mind. We do not just fear death, we fear disorder. We fear being lost in a universe that does not notice us. A bureaucratic afterlife, strange as it sounds, offers reassurance. It says, you will not be forgotten. Your name is written somewhere. Your life has been recorded. When your time comes, someone will come for you, not by accident, but because you are expected. That idea is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggests purpose, terrifying because it implies inevitability. There are no missed appointments in a perfect system. And yet, as these stories evolved, humans could not resist imagining ways the system might be challenged. Tales began to circulate of individuals who tricked the record keepers, who bribed the messengers, who altered the ledgers. In Chinese folklore, clever mortals sometimes negotiate with underworld officials, extending their lives by exploiting loopholes. In European legends, saints and tricksters alike occasionally outwit death's agents. These stories do not deny the existence of the system, they humanize it. They suggest that even the machinery of death has weaknesses, because it is operated by beings who, like us, can make mistakes or feel compassion. And that brings us back to the worker, the one who arrives when your name is called. In a bureaucratic afterlife, that worker is no longer a mysterious wanderer. They are an employee of the system. They have instructions. They have a schedule. They may even have quotas, routes, territories. They do not decide your fate. They execute it. Imagine for a moment what that would feel like. To wake each day knowing you will knock on doors that cannot refuse you. To carry a list of names that grows longer with every passing hour. To never question the authority that issued it. Would you become numb, efficient, detached? Or would you, as some stories suggest, begin to feel the weight of every life you carry? Because within these ancient bureaucracies, there is a quiet tension that becomes more visible as time goes on. The system may be orderly, but the individuals within it are not always emotionless. In some myths, messengers of death show mercy. In others, they hesitate, delay, or even refuse their duties, which raises a dangerous possibility. What if the worker of death could choose not to do their job? What if the system depended on individuals who could feel doubt? The idea seems small at first. A single worker hesitates, a single name is delayed. But in a system built on perfect timing, even a small disruption can ripple outward in ways no one predicted. Because if death is scheduled, then life is scheduled too. Births, endings, the balance of the world, all of it depends on the machinery running as intended. And when machines falter, consequences follow. By the end of the ancient era, humanity had created a vision of death that was no longer a simple mystery. It was a network, a hierarchy, a system of accountability that stretched beyond the visible world. But systems, no matter how carefully designed, carry a hidden fear. Not the fear that they will be cruel, but the fear that they will make a mistake. And that fear begins to take shape in stories. Stories of people who should have died but did not. People whose names were miswritten. People who slipped through the cracks of the afterlife's ledger. Stories that whisper a question no system can fully silence. What happens when death misses someone? Or worse, what happens when it takes the wrong person? There is a peculiar kind of fear that rarely gets spoken out loud. It isn't the fear of dying. It's the fear that when the moment comes, no one arrives, that your name is not called, that your existence slips through whatever system governs the end of life, and you are left in a strange, unfinished state between being and not being. If death is a job, then this is the nightmare of administrative failure, and it appears in stories everywhere. Across cultures, centuries, and languages, there are tales of people who were supposed to die but didn't. Not because they escaped danger, not because they survived against the odds, but because death, somehow, missed them. In European folklore, there are recurring legends of the man who outlived his time. Sometimes he meets a figure of death who admits a mistake. Sometimes a clerk in the underworld misreads a name. Sometimes two people with identical names are confused, and the wrong soul is taken. These stories are told quietly, almost apologetically, as if the storytellers themselves are unsure whether they should trust a universe that could make such an error. In East Asian tales, similar tales appear with striking detail. In certain versions of Chinese folklore, a soul is summoned to the underworld prematurely because its name matches another. When the error is discovered, the soul is returned to the body, but not unchanged. The person wakes with memories of the other side, with knowledge they were never meant to have. They become living proof that the system, however vast, is not flawless. Imagine that moment. You wake up and you remember standing in a place you were never supposed to see. You remember the officials, the records, the place where names are kept, and you realize your name was almost erased by mistake. Would you feel relieved, or would you feel unsettled? Because if the system can make an error once, it can make it again, and the next time it may not be corrected. This is the quiet tension that runs beneath these myths. Humans did not just imagine death as organized, they imagined it as vulnerable to failure. And that vulnerability reflects something deeply human, our lived experience of systems that are supposed to be fair, but sometimes aren't. We know what it feels like to be overlooked, to have a document lost, to have a number miswritten, to have someone say, "You were not on the list." So we imagined the same possibility in the ultimate list of all, the ledger of life and death. In Slavic folklore, there are tales of death arriving at the wrong house, knocking on the wrong door. In some versions, the person who answers convinces death that a mistake has been made and sends it away. In others, death insists that a mistake cannot occur, only to discover later that it has. The story is never just about survival. It is about the unsettling realization that the boundary between life and death might not be perfectly guarded. In South Asian storytelling traditions, there are narratives of people who encounter the messengers of death and are told almost casually, "It is not your time yet." They are sent back, sometimes with a warning, sometimes with a task, sometimes with the sense that their life has been extended by a clerical correction rather than a heroic escape. The tone of these stories is important. They are not triumphant. They are uneasy, because being missed by death does not feel like victory. It feels like postponement, like being placed back into a queue that will come around again, and the knowledge of that return lingers. There are even stories where being missed becomes a curse. A person who should have died continues to live in a state that is neither fully alive nor fully dead, unable to find peace, unable to leave, trapped in a world that no longer feels like it belongs to them. These stories blur into what later becomes the idea of ghosts, souls who were not properly received, not properly recorded, not properly guided. In this sense, the fear of being missed by death is not just about living longer. It is about losing your place in the order of things. Because if death is a system, then belonging to that system, even at the end, is part of what makes your life feel complete. It means your story has been acknowledged. It means your existence has been processed, witnessed, concluded. To be missed is to be unaccounted for, to be left in the margins of the ledger. There's a haunting medieval European tale about a man who tricks death and avoids being taken. At first, he celebrates. He has beaten the inevitable. Years pass, then decades. But as time goes on, something begins to feel wrong. The people around him age and die. Generations change. The world moves forward, and he remains. At first, it seems like a gift. Then it becomes isolation. Then it becomes a burden. because he begins to realize that death was not only an ending, it was a transition he was supposed to make, and by avoiding it, he has become detached from the rhythm of life itself. Eventually, he goes looking for death, begging to be taken, but now he cannot find it, because he is no longer on the list. This is the darker side of the fear, not just that death might come too soon, but that it might not come when it should, that you might be left in a world that has moved past you, in a timeline that no longer has a place for you. It is a fear that echoes in modern life, even if we don't frame it in mythological terms. The fear of being forgotten, of not being recognized, of not having your existence acknowledged by the systems that shape your life. Ancient stories simply placed that fear at the ultimate boundary. In some traditions, this fear takes on a moral dimension. The idea emerges that being missed by death is not random, but the result of imbalance, unfinished business, unfulfilled duty, unresolved injustice. The soul lingers because something has not been completed. The system pauses because the record is not yet final. In others, the explanation is more mechanical, an error in the cosmic ledger, a miscommunication between messengers, a name written incorrectly. Both explanations reveal the same underlying truth. Humans could not fully accept the idea of a perfect, infallible system of death. We needed to imagine its imperfections because we experience imperfection in everything else. And yet, even in these stories of error, there is always an eventual correction. The system notices, the ledger is amended, the worker returns. Because the deeper belief, the one that persists across all cultures, is that in the end, everyone will be accounted for. No one is permanently missed, which means that even the stories of escape and delay carry a quiet inevitability. The person who avoids death once will meet it later. The one who was taken by mistake will be returned, only to be called again at the proper time. The system bends, but it does not break. And that realization creates a strange emotional balance. On one hand, it offers reassurance. Your life matters enough to be recorded. Your end will not be random or forgotten. On the other hand, it reinforces inevitability. You cannot escape your place in the ledger forever. The worker will come, and when they do, it will not be an accident. It will be your turn. But what about the worker themselves? If they are part of a system that can make mistakes, if they are the one who must correct those mistakes, what does that do to them? Imagine being the one who arrives at the wrong door. Imagine seeing the fear in someone's eyes, only to realize you were not meant to be there. Imagine leaving, knowing you will have to return one day, and that they will remember you. What kind of weight does that place on the person whose job is to end lives? Because as these stories evolve, something new begins to appear in the myths, not just fallible systems, but emotional workers, figures of death who feel regret, who hesitate, who question their role. The job of death is no longer just procedural, it is personal. And in the next chapter, the stories turn inward, exploring a haunting possibility that changes everything we know about the one who carries death. What if they don't always want to do it?
There is a moment just before the end of a life that stories often describe with unusual tenderness. The room is quiet. The air feels different, as if the world itself has paused to listen. And in that stillness, the one who has come to carry death is not always cold or distant. Sometimes they hesitate. For centuries, human imagination did something unexpected with the figure of death. It gave them emotions, not rage, not cruelty, but doubt, weariness, even sorrow. Across continents and eras, tales began to surface of reapers who did their job because they had to, not because they wanted to. The shift is subtle but powerful. Death is no longer just a function of the universe. Death becomes a character, and characters can feel. In late medieval Europe, as plagues swept through cities and villages, the image of the Reaper grew sharper. People saw death everywhere, in crowded streets, in quiet homes, in entire families lost within days. It would have been easy to imagine death as merciless. Instead, in many oral traditions, something gentler emerged. Death was described as patient, as inevitable, yes, but not eager. In some folk tales, the Reaper sits beside the dying, waiting for the right moment, as if aware that rushing would be an act of cruelty. This is not the image of a hunter. It is the image of a worker bound by timing. In parts of Central and Eastern Europe, stories tell of death as a thin, tired figure who walks from house to house with a list. When he reaches the home of a child, he pauses. Sometimes he lingers outside, listening to laughter, to the small sounds of a life that has barely begun. In a few versions of the tale, he leaves and returns later, unable to carry out his duty immediately. But he always returns, because the rules do not change. In Islamic storytelling traditions, there are reflections on the angel tasked with taking souls, often described as neither cruel nor kind, but obedient, carrying out the command of a higher will. Yet even within these narratives, there are moments of emotional tension. The angel is aware of the sorrow left behind, aware of the separation that follows each task. Awareness is the seed of empathy, and empathy makes the job heavier. In Japanese folklore, spirits associated with death are sometimes depicted not as terrifying forces, but as guides who lead the soul gently away from the world. The act is not violent, it is a quiet escort. The Reaper does not snatch life, they guide it to its next place. Across these stories, a pattern forms. Death is not always an enemy. Sometimes, death is a reluctant necessity. And that reluctance opens a door to a deeper question. If death is carried out by a being capable of feeling, what does it do to them over time? Imagine centuries of walking into rooms where grief is about to begin. Imagine being present at the final breath of every kind of person, young, old, kind, cruel, ordinary, extraordinary. Imagine carrying each of those moments with you, day after day, year after year, with no end to your assignment. Even the strongest mind would begin to change. Some stories suggest that death grows numb, detached from the weight of the lives they carry. But others go in the opposite direction. They imagine a Reaper who becomes more sensitive over time, not less, more aware of the value of each life, more conscious of the impact of their work. There is a haunting European folk story about a Reaper who begins to cry. He arrives at a home where a mother is singing to her child, unaware that her time has come. The Reaper listens, and something in him breaks. He has taken thousands of lives, but this moment feels different. He cannot explain why. He simply feels it. He steps inside, stands at the edge of the room, and waits. Minutes pass, then longer. The rules say he must act, but for the first time, he does not want to. Eventually, he completes his duty. The song ends, the room falls silent, and the Reaper leaves carrying not just the soul he was assigned to take, but the memory of that song. From that day forward, the story says, the Reaper is never the same. He begins to see each life not as a name on a list, but as a world full of moments he will never fully understand, but cannot ignore. This kind of story does something remarkable. It does not remove the inevitability of death. It does not suggest the job can be abandoned, but it changes the emotional relationship between humans and the one who carries death. The Reaper is no longer a faceless function. The Reaper is a witness to every ending, and witnessing creates connection. There are even tales in which the Reaper attempts to defy their orders. In one narrative told in various forms across Europe, death refuses to take a specific person. a kind ruler, a compassionate healer, a child whose life feels too brief. For a time, the refusal seems to succeed. The person lives on, but the consequences begin to ripple outward. The balance of life and death begins to shift. Others who were meant to live now suffer. The system strains under the disruption, and eventually the reaper is forced to complete the task they delayed, realizing their compassion, however sincere, cannot override the larger order they serve. It's a tragic lesson. Kindness, in this role, can create unintended harm, and so the reaper learns to carry a difficult truth. Their duty is not to choose who deserves to live or die. Their duty is to maintain a balance that no single human perspective can fully grasp. That knowledge does not make the work easier. It makes it heavier, because now the reaper understands what is lost with each life, but also understands that the loss cannot be avoided. There are also darker variations of these stories, ones where the reaper's regret turns into resentment, where centuries of carrying out the same task erode their sense of purpose. In some myths, death becomes bitter, not because they enjoy their work, but because they are trapped in it, unable to stop. These stories reflect a very human fear, being bound to a role you did not choose, repeating it endlessly, unable to change the outcome. It is the fear of being a cog in a machine too large to question. By giving that fear to the figure of death, humans found a way to express something about their own lives, the tension between duty and desire, between responsibility and personal feeling. And yet, even in the darkest versions of these myths, the reaper does not abandon the job entirely, because if they did, what would happen? What would a world look like where the worker of death simply stopped showing up? At first, it might seem like a miracle. No one would die. Families would not be torn apart. Loss would disappear. But the stories that explore this possibility rarely end in celebration, because death, as terrible as it feels, is also part of a balance that allows life to renew itself. Without endings, beginnings lose their meaning. Without limits, growth becomes stagnation. In the imagination of these cultures, the reaper's regret is real, but so is the necessity of their work, and that creates a tension that cannot be resolved. A worker who feels but cannot stop, a duty that hurts but must continue. As these stories move forward through time, the figure of death becomes more complex, more human, more emotionally layered. No longer just a guide or a clerk in a cosmic bureaucracy, the reaper becomes something else entirely, a being who carries the weight of every life they end, a being who remembers. And if they remember, what happens when those memories become too much to bear? What happens when the worker of death, after centuries of carrying out their task, finally reaches a point where they can no longer continue? Because in the next chapter, the stories take a radical turn. They imagine the unthinkable, a day when death itself stops working.
At first, no one noticed. There was no announcement, no sign in the sky, no warning carried on the wind. Life simply continued, as it always had. Births, meals, arguments, laughter, the ordinary rhythm of human existence. But somewhere, in the unseen machinery that had guided every ending since the beginning of memory, something stopped. A worker did not arrive. A name was not called. A door that should have opened remained closed. And for the first time in the history of the world, a person who was meant to die did not. In myth and story, this moment is often quiet, almost invisible, a single thread left uncut, a single life that lingers one breath longer than it should. But a system built on perfect timing does not absorb disruption gracefully. One missed moment becomes two. Two become a pattern, and slowly, subtly at first, the world begins to change. In European folklore, there is a well-known tale in which death is captured. tricked by a clever human and locked away in a box, or bound in chains, or sealed inside a tree. The details vary from country to country, but the consequence is always the same. No one can die. At first, it feels like a miracle. A soldier on the battlefield is struck but does not fall. An elder on a sickbed lingers, breathing shallowly but never crossing the threshold. A child with a fever remains suspending between suffering and release. The world, for a moment, believes it has defeated its oldest enemy. People celebrate. They laugh at the idea that death has been outwitted, that the worker who once arrived at every door has been stopped by human cleverness. But celebration does not last, because something begins to feel wrong. The wounded do not heal, but they do not die either. The sick do not recover, but they do not pass away. The old do not leave, but they do not grow younger. Life stretches, but it does not renew. The balance begins to tilt. In one version of this story, a village becomes crowded with those who should have died but cannot. Beds fill with people who cannot recover. Families are forced to care for loved ones who linger in a state that is neither life nor death. The absence of endings becomes a different kind of suffering, one that has no release. The message is unsettling. Death, for all its pain, was also a doorway. And without that doorway, the house of life begins to overflow. This idea appears in many cultures, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes as a philosophical reflection. In ancient Greek myth, there is a story of a king who chains the figure of death, preventing anyone from dying. The gods themselves become alarmed because the natural order has been disrupted. Warriors cannot fall. Sacrifices cannot be completed. The cycle of life and death, which sustains the world, begins to break down. The gods intervene. Death is released, and the world breathes again. It's a strange reversal of expectation. Instead of fearing the return of death, the story suggests relief. The system, painful as it is, has resumed its function. The worker has returned to their post. Across the ocean, in Mesoamerican traditions, there are echoes of similar ideas. The necessity of death to maintain the movement of the sun, the renewal of life, the balance of the cosmos. If death ceases, the world does not become a paradise. It becomes unstable. Because life in these worldviews is not meant to be endless in a static form. It is meant to flow, to transform, to give way to new growth. The absence of death freezes that flow. But these are ancient stories, myths, symbols. So we ask a more modern version of the same question. What would it actually mean if no one could die? At first glance, it sounds like a dream, the end of loss, the end of grief, the end of fear. But as we look closer, the consequences become more complex. Hospitals would fill beyond capacity with patients who cannot recover. Resources, food, water, space would become strained as populations grow without limit. Ecosystems would collapse under the weight of organisms that cannot complete their natural cycles. Evolution would stall. Renewal would cease. And on a personal level, the meaning of time itself would change. Deadlines would disappear. Urgency would fade. The knowledge that life is finite, one of the forces that gives human choices their weight, would vanish. Would love feel the same if it were guaranteed to last forever? Would courage feel the same if there were no risk? Would meaning survive in a world without endings? These are the questions hidden beneath the ancient myths of death's absence. They are not simply about mortality, they are about the structure of existence itself. In many of these stories, the figure of death is eventually released not because humans grow wise, but because the consequences of its absence become unbearable. The worker returns, sometimes angry, sometimes weary, sometimes silent, but always necessary. And when they return, something has changed. The world has seen what it looks like without them, and it does not want to see it again. There is a particularly haunting variation of this theme in later literature, where death simply stops showing up. No chains, no trickery, no imprisonment. The worker just ceases to perform their duty. At first, the authorities deny it. They assume it is a statistical anomaly, a temporary shift in numbers. But as days turn into weeks and weeks into months, the truth becomes undeniable. No one is dying. The reaction is not celebration. It is confusion, then anxiety, then fear. Governments struggle to explain it. Religious institutions reinterpret it. Families sit beside loved ones who linger in a state of suspended suffering. The absence of death reveals how deeply it was woven into every aspect of life: medical systems, legal structures, cultural rituals, personal expectations. Without death, the concept of an ending disappears, and with it, the structure of stories themselves. Because every story, every life, has always been shaped by the knowledge that it will conclude. Remove that conclusion, and the narrative stretches indefinitely, losing its form. In these modern retellings, the return of death is often portrayed not as a tragedy, but as a restoration. The worker resumes their role, and the world, though still filled with grief, regains its balance. It is a difficult truth to accept, that something we fear so deeply might also be something we need. But the myths insist on it. They tell us that death is not an error in the system of life. It is part of the system. The worker who carries it is not an intruder, but an essential role in a larger design. And yet this raises a question that grows louder with each chapter. If death is necessary, who decided that? Who created the system that requires a worker to carry out this task? Who wrote the rules that determine when each life ends? Who built the ledger, the offices, the pathways, the judgments? If death is a job, then there must be an employer, a source, an authority that defined the role and set its conditions. Is it a god, a law of nature, a force beyond human understanding? Or is it something more abstract, an idea humans created to make sense of the patterns they observed? As the stories move forward, they begin to turn toward this question. They move beyond the worker and the system, and they begin to search for the origin of the job itself. Because once you accept that death is not random, not chaotic, but structured and necessary, you are left with one final unsettling curiosity. Who wrote the job description, and why was it written at all? By now, the picture has grown uncomfortably clear. There is a worker, there is a system, there are ledgers, judgments, schedules, and a balance that must be maintained. And if all of that exists, then somewhere, somehow, there must be a set of rules. But rules do not write themselves. Someone or something had to decide that life would end, that endings would be counted, that a boundary would be enforced. The deeper we move into this idea, the less we are talking about death as an event, and the more we are talking about death as a design. Which leads to a question as old as thought itself. Who designed it? In the earliest mythologies, the answer is often simple, even if it is not always comforting. The rules of death are set by gods, not by the worker who carries it out, but by higher powers who determine when a life begins and when it ends. In Greek tradition, this authority takes form in the Moirai, the Fates, three figures who spin, measure, and cut the thread of life. One spins the thread at birth, one measures its length, and one cuts it at the appointed time. Even the gods, in many tellings, do not interfere with their decisions. The worker of death, whoever carries it out, is merely the final hand that follows the cut. In Norse mythology, a similar role is played by the Norns, who carved destiny into the roots of the world tree. Lives are inscribed before they unfold. Endings are not accidents, they are written. In Hindu philosophy, the universe operates through cycles governed by dharma and karma. The figure of Yama does not invent the rules of death, he enforces them. He judges according to a cosmic law that exists beyond any individual will. Lives end when the balance of action and consequence reaches its conclusion. Across these traditions, the same pattern appears.
The worker of death is not the author of death. They are an agent, a function within a larger order. But this answer, while clear, does not satisfy everyone, because it pushes the question one step further back. If the gods wrote the rules, who gave the gods that authority? If cosmic law governs death, where did that law come from? As human thought evolved, philosophers began to wrestle with this problem directly. In ancient Greece, thinkers like Plato and Aristotle explored the idea that the universe might operate according to rational principles, patterns that exist independently of mythological figures. Death is not assigned by a deity in the way a king assigns a task. It emerges from the nature of existence itself. Everything that is born must change. Everything that changes must eventually end. In this framework, death does not need a writer. It is written into the structure of reality. But even here, the human mind resists abstraction. It is easier to understand a role than a law, a worker than a process. So even as philosophy moves toward impersonal explanations, imagination continues to personify death as a being with duties, because duties feel closer to human experience than abstract inevitability. During the Enlightenment, as science began to replace myth as the primary way of explaining the world, death was increasingly understood as a biological process, the failure of the body, the breakdown of systems, the end of function. No reaper required, no ledger needed. And yet, the language of rules did not disappear. Biology has its own rules, genetic instructions, cellular lifespans, ecological balances. Species live, reproduce, and die according to patterns that can be studied and predicted. In a sense, science replaced the divine rulebook with a natural one. The question remained the same. Why are the rules the way they are? Why must life end at all? Some philosophers argued that death is the price of individuality. For new life to emerge, old life must make space. Without endings, there can be no beginnings. Without death, evolution itself would stall. The world would freeze in its current form, unable to adapt or renew. In this sense, death is not an imposed punishment. It is a condition of change. Others took a more existential view. Thinkers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre suggested that the universe does not assign meaning or rules in the way myths describe. Instead, humans create meaning within a world that simply exists. Death is not a job someone was assigned. It is a fact of existence that we interpret through stories, roles, and systems because we need those structures to make sense of our lives. In other words, the worker of death may not exist outside our imagination, but the function they represent is real. We need a way to think about endings. We need a way to integrate loss into a coherent story. So we invent roles, rules, and authorities to hold that concept. But even this explanation does not fully dissolve the mystery, because the human experience of death is not purely rational. It's emotional, personal, immediate. When someone we love dies, it does not feel like a biological process or a philosophical necessity. It feels like something was taken. And when something feels taken, the mind instinctively asks, by whom? That instinct brings us back again and again to the idea of a worker, a figure who arrives, a role that is carried out, a job that must be done. Whether that figure exists in reality or only in imagination, the structure of the idea remains powerful. It gives shape to grief. It gives form to fear. It allows us to ask questions we cannot ask of an abstract process. Why now? Why them? Why this way? And even if there are no answers, the act of asking feels different when there is a someone to address. There is also a moral dimension hidden in this question of rules. If death follows rules, then those rules can be judged. Humans have always been moral creatures. We evaluate fairness, justice, and purpose. By framing death as a system with rules, we create a space to wrestle with those questions, even if we never find satisfying answers. In religious traditions, this often leads to the idea of divine justice, that even if the timing of death seems unfair in the moment, there is a larger plan or balance we cannot see. In secular thought, it leads to the idea that meaning must be created in the face of an indifferent universe, that the value of a life is not measured by its length, but by its impact, its relationships, its experiences. Both approaches attempt to reconcile the same tension. We want the rules to make sense. We want the system to be meaningful. We want the worker, if they exist, to be part of a design we can accept. But there is one more possibility, one that is rarely stated directly, but lingers at the edge of these discussions. What if the rules were not written once, long ago, by a distant authority? What if the rules are being written continuously, by the very structure of life itself, by the interactions of living beings, by the balance of ecosystems, by the unfolding of time? In that case, the worker of death is not following a static script. They are participating in an ongoing process, adapting, responding, maintaining a balance that is always shifting. This idea brings the concept of death closer to something like a natural force, a role that emerges from the needs of the system rather than being imposed from above. And yet, even here, the human mind returns to personification, because we understand roles better than forces, duties better than dynamics. So we continue to imagine the worker. We continue to imagine the rules. We continue to imagine that somewhere there is a ledger, a list, a structure that gives order to the most profound transition any of us will ever experience. But after all this, after myths and philosophies and sciences, we are left with a quiet realization. Whether the rules were written by gods, by nature, or by the human need for meaning, we respond to them in the same way. We live our lives knowing they are finite. We make choices because time is limited. We love more intensely because we know there will be a last moment. In a strange way, the existence of rules, real or imagined, gives shape to everything we do, which leads to a final, deeply human question. If we imagine death as a worker, and we imagine rules that guide them, why does that idea comfort us? Why, across history and culture, have humans repeatedly chosen to picture death not as a blind force, but as a being with a role, a duty, and perhaps even a conscience?
Chapter 7. The Psychological Comfort of a Worker Named Death. If you sit quietly and listen to the way people speak about loss, something subtle begins to emerge. We rarely describe death as a process. We describe it as an arrival. We lost him last night. She was taken too soon. It was her time. He went peacefully. Even in modern scientific language, the instinct to personify remains. We speak as if something came, something decided, something completed a task. The language itself reveals a pattern in the human mind. We do not relate easily to endings that have no face. So we give death one. And that face, across cultures and centuries, becomes a worker. Not a monster, not a villain, a worker. There is a psychological reason for this, and it reaches deep into the structure of how humans understand the world. Our brains are wired to recognize agency, to see intention behind events. This instinct helped our ancestors survive. If the grass moved, it was safer to assume something caused it. If something caused it, that something could be predicted, avoided, or understood. Randomness, by contrast, offers nothing to grasp. So, when confronted with the most profound randomness of all, the end of life, the mind does what it has always done. It assigns a role. A worker who arrives at a specific moment for a specific reason, following a specific set of rules. This transforms death from chaos into procedure, and procedure, even when it is painful, is easier to accept than chaos. Modern psychology has explored this tendency through theories of how humans cope with mortality. One influential framework,
often associated with thinkers like Ernest Becker, suggests that much of human culture is shaped by our awareness of death and our attempt to manage the anxiety it creates. According to this view, we build systems of meaning, religions, philosophies, narratives, to protect ourselves from the terror of knowing that our lives will end. Personifying death as a worker is one of those systems. It tells us your life does not end randomly. It ends when it is your turn. This idea does not remove the pain of loss, but it gives it a frame. It suggests that there is a sequence, a timing, a place for each life within a larger structure, and that structure can be emotionally stabilizing. Consider the difference between two thoughts. The first, my loved one died because bodies fail unpredictably, because cells break down, because the universe is indifferent. The second, my loved one's time had come. The one who carries death arrived when it was their moment. Both describe the same event, but they feel very different. The first emphasizes randomness. The second implies order. Humans almost universally lean toward the second. There is also something else hidden in this idea of a worker. Workers can be understood. They have duties, schedules, constraints. They are not acting out of personal malice. They are not targeting us. They are doing a job that exists beyond any single individual life. This softens the emotional blow. If death is a villain, then every loss feels like an attack. If death is a worker, then loss feels like a requirement of a larger system. Still painful, but less personal. This distinction appears again and again in the way cultures describe death. In many traditions, the figure who comes at the end is not portrayed as angry or cruel, but as calm, neutral, even gentle. The image of a guide who leads the soul away, of a ferryman who carries it across a river, of an official who processes its passage, these are all variations of the same psychological mechanism. They make the transition feel guided, escorted, observed, and that reduces the fear of being alone in the final moment. Loneliness is one of the deepest human fears. To imagine dying alone, unnoticed, unaccompanied, is profoundly unsettling. The idea of a worker named Death, someone who comes specifically for you, transforms that moment into an encounter. You are not alone. Someone came. You were expected. Even the imagery of the list or ledger plays a role in this comfort. To believe that your name is written somewhere, that your life has been recorded, that your end will be noted, it affirms that your existence mattered enough to be counted. It is a quiet antidote to the fear of being forgotten. In grief, this idea can become even more important. When people lose someone they love, they often search for meaning in the timing of that loss. Why now? Why this way? Why this person? The concept of death as a worker allows for a kind of narrative answer. It suggests that there was a moment assigned, a point at which the worker was meant to arrive. Even if we do not understand the reasons, we can imagine that the moment had a place in the larger structure of things. This does not erase sorrow, but it gives sorrow a shape. And shaped sorrow is easier to carry than shapeless grief. There's also a paradox here that psychologists have noted. The same personification that comforts us can also create fear. The image of a figure who will one day come for you can be unsettling, especially in childhood, when imagination is vivid and boundaries between metaphor and reality are less defined. But even this fear has a structure. A formless void is more frightening than a figure you can picture. A nameless ending is more terrifying than a role you can describe. By giving death a face, even a frightening one, the mind makes it something that can be thought about, discussed, even negotiated with in stories. Children's tales often include characters who trick or bargain with death, not because the storytellers believed these stories literally, but because they allowed listeners to engage with the idea of mortality in a way that felt active rather than helpless. If death is a worker, then perhaps it can be delayed. Perhaps it can be reasoned with. Perhaps it follows rules that can be understood. These possibilities, even when we know they are not real, give us a sense of agency in the face of something that offers none. As people grow older, the image often softens. The frightening reaper of childhood becomes, in some narratives, a quiet guide, a presence that is neither friend nor enemy, but part of the natural order. The emotional tone shifts from fear to acceptance. And that acceptance is one of the most important psychological functions of this idea, because eventually every human being must come to terms with their own mortality. And the way we imagine death influences how we live before it arrives. If death is random and meaningless, life can feel fragile and arbitrary. If death is part of a system, part of a process, part of a role being carried out, then life can feel like a chapter in a larger story, one that has a beginning, a middle, and an end that fits within a larger pattern. This does not require belief in any specific religion or myth. Even in secular contexts, people speak of life cycles, of the natural course of things, of the right time. A language of order persists even when the metaphysical framework changes. It is a testament to how deeply the human mind seeks structure in the face of uncertainty. There is also a quiet empathy that emerges when we imagine death as a worker. If it is a job, then the one who does it might not enjoy it. They might feel the weight of it. They might carry the memory of every life they end. This idea, explored in stories across cultures, transforms death from an adversary into something almost tragic, a being bound to a duty that no one else can perform. And in that transformation, something surprising happens. We begin to feel compassion for the very thing we fear. It's a complex emotional shift, but a meaningful one. It suggests that death is not separate from life, not opposed to it, but intertwined with it, another role within the same system that allows existence to continue. By the time we reach this understanding, the image of death as a worker has done its psychological work. It has taken something vast, abstract, and terrifying and given it a shape that the human mind can approach. A figure, a role, a job. But this idea leaves us with one final, deeply personal reflection. If death is a worker who comes for each of us in turn, if our names are written, our moments scheduled, our lives recorded, then what does that make us? Are we simply entries in a ledger, or are we something more? Stories, relationships, moments of meaning that exist before the worker arrives and continue to matter after they leave. Because in the final chapter, we turn from the figure of death back to ourselves, to the lives we live before the knock on the door, to the question that matters more than who carries death, or who wrote the rules, or how the system works. A question that every human being, in every culture, eventually faces.
The door does not look important. It is not golden, it does not glow. There is no thunder or choir or cold wind leaking from its frame. It looks like a door you might pass in a hallway without noticing. Wood worn by years, a handle polished by countless hands that never realized they were touching the final threshold of something they had spent their entire lives imagining. You stand in front of it, and for the first time, your heartbeat is not a countdown. It is simply a sound, steady, present, alive in a way you have never fully felt before, because all your life it was always moving toward a final silence. But here, in this moment, time feels paused, not frozen like in a nightmare, but softened, as if the world has given you a breath you never knew you were owed. And then, from behind you, a voice speaks, not loud, not frightening, just human. You're early. You turn.
And there they are. Not a skeleton, not a shadow, not a monster cloaked in inevitability. A person. Tired eyes that have seen more endings than any story could hold. Hands that look strong, but not violent. Shoulders carrying something invisible but undeniably heavy. If you passed them on a street, you might not remember their face. But here, in this space, you understand instantly who they are. The one who does the job. They don't hold a weapon, they don't carry a scythe. They carry a small notebook, its pages filled with names written in careful, deliberate ink. Some are crossed out, some are circled, some are underlined as if their endings required special care. They look at you, not through you, not beyond you, at you. You've been thinking about me, they say. And it isn't a question, because of course you have. Everyone does. Sometimes in whispers, sometimes in fear, sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep when your mind wanders to the edge of existence and asks the question it can never fully answer. What happens when it's my turn? You expect them to judge you, to weigh you, to measure your life against some invisible scale, but they don't. Instead, they ask something else. Did you live it the way you wanted? The question lands heavier than any verdict ever could, because suddenly this meeting is not about them, it's about you. All the days you rushed through, all the moments you thought were small, all the times you said later, believing there would always be more time waiting patiently for you to arrive. They sit beside you, as if this is not the first conversation they've had like this, as if every human being at some point sits here and faces not their end, but their reflection. You know, they say softly, people imagine I come to take something away. They flip open the notebook and you see names you don't recognize, but you feel them. Lives that were lived fully, lives cut short, lives complicated, messy, beautiful, unfinished. But that's not really the job. They close the notebook again. My job is to arrive at the exact moment when a story has said everything it was meant to say. You think about your own story, all its chapters, all its unfinished sentences, the pages you wish you could rewrite, the ones you wish you had read more carefully while you were living them. What if I'm not ready, you ask? The worker named Death doesn't laugh, doesn't sigh, doesn't rush you. They nod. Most people aren't, they admit, but readiness isn't what decides the moment. Then what does? They glance at the door, and for a second you think you see something on its surface, faint shapes like memories pressed into wood, laughter, tears, faces, places, all the fragments of a life gathered into something whole. Completion, they say. The word feels strange, because you have always thought of death as interruption, as theft, as something that cuts through life like a blade. But here, sitting beside the one who does the job, you begin to understand a different idea, that endings are not always violence. Sometimes they are punctuation, a full stop at the end of a sentence that could not go on forever. You look at them again, really look this time, and you notice something unexpected. Sadness. Not the kind that breaks a person, but the kind that stays with them quietly, like a shadow that never fully leaves. Does it hurt, you ask? To do this job? They don't answer immediately, because this is the one question no one ever asks them while they're alive. It used to, they finally say. Every time, every life, every goodbye. They rest their hand lightly on the notebook. But over time, I learned something. I'm not the one ending anything. I'm just the one who arrives when it's already complete. They look back at you, and for a moment, you see something almost like kindness in their expression. And the truth is, they continue, the only people who meet me peacefully are the ones who understood that long before I arrived. Silence settles between you. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, just real. You think about your own life again, not the big achievements, not the milestones everyone else noticed, but the quiet things, the conversations that mattered, the people you loved, the small decisions that shaped you in ways no one ever saw. You realize that if death is a worker, then life is not a test. It is a process, a series of moments handed to you one by one with no guarantee of how many you will receive. And the worker's job is simply to close the book when the pages run out. They stand, slowly, as if giving you time. I don't rush anyone, they say gently, but I don't delay either. They gesture toward the door, and you understand what comes next, not as a threat, not as a punishment, as a continuation of something you have always been moving toward even when you pretended you weren't. You take a step forward, then pause. One last question, you say. They nod. Will I remember this conversation? They consider it. Then they answer with a truth that feels both comforting and impossible. You won't remember the words, they say, but you'll carry the understanding. You reach for the handle. It feels warm, familiar, like something you have touched before, in dreams or in thoughts you never fully finished. You turn it, and just before the door opens, you hear their voice one last time behind you. Tell the ones who are still living something for me, they say. You look back. What should I tell them? They smile, not a frightening smile, not a mysterious one, just a human smile, worn by someone who has seen the entire spectrum of what it means to exist. Tell them I'm not chasing them, I'm waiting. Pause, waiting for them to finish their story. The door opens. Light, not blinding, not overwhelming, just enough to see what lies ahead. And as you step through, you realize something you were never able to understand while you were alive. If death is a job, then life is not something to fear losing. It is something to use, fully, deeply, completely. Because one day, when you finally meet the one who does the job, the only question that will matter is not how long your life was,